Well, hi there, Saxophone fans. Every other Tuesday, I come to you from Saxophone World Headquarters. I'm down in our ultra top secret command and control bunker located in Sector R of New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz. I'm Steve Goodson, and if you have any questions about exactly who I am, just ask your mama. Your mama knows who I am for sure. Now listen, we're going to begin tonight a series of Facebook Live seminars, and these seminars are all going to be about saxophone acoustics. And I got to tell you, it is one of the most misunderstood things in the musical world. Now I want to emphasize that tonight we're going to begin this series. There's a lot to know, and I don't want any of you to think that I was born knowing it. I had to study and learn. The thing that motivated me more than anything else to bring this series of discussions of saxophone acoustics to you is this. On one of the many discussion groups that I participate in, there were a couple of small town pad shellackers telling me about what all they had read about saxophone acoustics. Well, good for them. Any of you who've ever visited me here at my office in New Orleans know that I have a huge library of stuff. If I've ever found a book about woodwind acoustics or heard about it, I got it. And I've read and studied them all, but here's the difference. These guys, hey, about what all they've read. Well, let me ask you this. How many horns have you built yourself of your own design that had some acoustic improvement? I tell you, I can only speak for myself in that, there are thousands of horns all over the world that's got my name on them. And I think the people that own those horns all say, damn, these things play better. Well, that was a goal. And also, you may have noticed, if you've ever read over the years the Saxophone Journal, I was a full-time paid writer for them, or the Saxophone Today magazine, I was a full-time paid writer for them. And you'll find my writings in a lot of other magazines as well. Now, wait a minute, I'm not talking about what I read. I'm talking about what I've actually done. And I think that kind of qualifies me to speak on this topic. Now, here's a couple of promises I'm going to make to you about tonight's presentation. Number one, there's not going to be any higher math involved. Okay? No higher math. Number two, there's not going to be a whiteboard with a bunch of diagrams of waves and pressure nodes and, that sort of thing, closed cones and all that. We're not going to do this. I'm going to try to do this in such a fashion that we have the basics covered for you, and I'm going to particularly kind of try to address what I think are the needs of the repair industry. And the thing is that a basic understanding of how the science of a saxophone works is critical to doing a good job. So let's get started and try to start in a logical place, and that is, how do we provide the energy that's necessary for a saxophone to make music? Well, the answer is that we literally put the mouthpiece in our mouth and we blow. And so our body is providing a source of continuous energy by making the reed open and close against the mouthpiece. And that oscillating function of the reed, opening and closing very rapidly, combined with some very natural resonances that occur due to the configuration of the cones in the air, it gives some airflow and it gives some pressure. Now, the flow of this energy wave, now understand that what's happening is the energy wave is moving the molecules of the air, okay? One to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's also, people understand maybe that flow, but something they don't understand is the importance of the pressure. Now, of course, as we get the wave going through here and start making some music, the sound of the saxophone comes out two places. Place number one, obviously, is the bell of the saxophone. Sure, that's what it's for, and we're going to address the function of the bell a little later. But also, and very importantly, it emanates from the first open tone hole. Now, there's a lot to be said about that, and it's not as simple as you might think. Now, here's something you need to understand before you get to designing and building your first saxophone. You put this energy in with your body, and the vast majority of that energy is lost to two sources. Source number one is friction with the tube, with the air, with all that stuff is inside there. That's called a viscous loss. And then another thing, and this is a smaller component of the overall loss, and that is a thermal loss. In other words, as we're blowing warm air from our body into the horn, we're probably going to be warming up some of the air inside the horn. I used to have a teacher many years ago. This guy was into all kind of Middle Eastern mysticism and all that. He was a great player and a good guy. And he used to tell me, now, Steve, I want you to always blow from the bottom of your lungs. Why? Because the air is warmer from there. Warmer air plays better. Well, warmer air is less resistant, and that's why when we say, well, here, let me run a few scales before we run out on the stage and warm up my horn, you better believe that's important, because the thing is that what you got to do is, wait a minute, Steve, my video is sideways? You're kidding. It is sideways. It looks right side up to me. Well, we can adjust that. Here, let's do that thing. How about that? Wait a minute. Okay, I didn't know. See, I only see what's going on in here. All right, how about that? Is that better? Okay, all right, my video is no longer sideways. Okay, sorry about that. That's operator error on my part. Everybody knows I'm a knucklehead. But anyway, we were talking about warmer air and warming up the horn. It's, just warmer air is less resistant, and that's important. So the horn, as I said, we can calculate the way the waves go through the horn and where they go and where they start and stop. We can also calculate where the natural resonances of the horn are. And that's very important. Now, you got to do some math to do that. I can tell you that maybe in a future episode we'll do that. But for right now, I can tell you that those resonances determine the frequency of that energy wave as it goes through there, and also the frequency is what determines the pitch. So that's what happens. Now, let's imagine a couple of things now. If you got your saxophone, and you can try this on your horn, you can take your horn, put it in your mouth, and blow with very, very, very little pressure. And what you're going to hear is, you're going to hear just the sound of the air going between the reed and the top of the mouthpiece. Okay, and so yes, Jody Espina, I'm honored that you're here. So, at any rate, you'll get a little bit of air going through that narrow gap. But if you increase the pressure by simply blowing a little harder, what's going to happen? There's going to be enough pressure exerted to bend that reed, and that reed is going to go up and down and up and down. And if you blow it hard enough, it's going to close completely, and the flow of the air goes to zero. And so you got to be sure that you kind of temper your the amount of pressure. You're going to be required to produce a continuous flow of air at a pressure that's above the still air in the room, and that's going to be the source of energy, and we're going to convert that steady power into acoustic power by moving that reed. And reeds, a given reed is going to have different characteristics, and we all know that. Now, those of you that hang with me know that I prefer synthetic reeds. Why? Because they play the same every day. What should you do? Well, you should do what's right for you. But you need to understand that moving that reed up and down and creating that oscillation is what provides the energy to go through the bore and make some music. And understand now that the vast majority of our input is going to be lost just through friction. And very little of it's actually going to be radiated out of the bell. Now, for a small variation in the pressure, and is going to give you different results. And you can plot this stuff, and you'll find out a couple of interesting things. If you increase the pressure, in other words, you're going to play a little louder, all things being equal, it's going to be louder, of course. But also, what's going to happen is it is going to change the mix of overtones. Did you hear me? It's going to change the mix of overtones. And that's why we need to say that if we play at a soft or moderate volume, we have a nice, easy, symmetrical wave. Just goes just like that. And that's that nice mellow sound that everybody likes about the saxophone. But then, as we increase that pressure, we began to introduce some of those upper partials, and the cycle that the reed closes begins to vary, and we get more and more upper harmonics, so the sound gets brighter and brighter and brighter. No, it's not your imagination. And then ultimately what's going to happen is that sound's going to become very harsh, and that is going to be very harsh because you got a phenomenon known as clipping, where you actually get that wave, instead of being nice and rounded and symmetrical, where it has square waveforms, and that's not a good thing. So, or not in most situations. Anybody who's ever played a rock and roll gig with me knows that one thing I'm known for is that chainsaw tone of mine. And yeah, that's true. So there's some things other than just the air pressure that can change this sound. Now, as we put that mouthpiece and reed in our mouth like this, if we change the position of our lower lip on the reed, it's like moving the fulcrum, and you can begin to induce clipping or make it a little more mellow. And I try to teach my private students that something we don't want to do is be changing our embouchure all the time. We want to try to learn to play good with one embouchure. But changing that position will change the pressure on the reed itself. And understand this, if you play, the reed itself has got a natural sound, but it's a squeak. It's not anything anybody gonna pay you anything to listen to. So the correct embouchure is going to give you the sound that people want to pay big bucks to listen to. So y'all listen to your teachers about that sort of thing. Now, let's move over into some of the real physics involved in this stuff. All right, as you know, your saxophone is open at the mouthpiece end. There's a little gap between the mouthpiece and a reed, and then on down into the horn. And I'm going to do everything in straight lines like a straight soprano, okay? But the same thing applies to everything from soprano to contrabass. But as we move on down, of course, the end of the saxophone, the bell, is quite open. And so at the mouthpiece end, even if you play in very open mouthpieces, that's not very open. And that's closed enough to be considered a stop, closed all the way. And remember, the reed is doing this. And so, yeah, it is closed a lot of the time. So understand that the saxophone is going to play like what's called a closed pipe. And it's conical, and we're going to get on with the ramifications of that in just a few minutes. Now, I want you to understand, it's something I brought to your attention on several previous seminars, that your saxophone is, if you straighten out the neck and the rest of it, is a truncated cone up at the mouthpiece end. There is no point. No point. But we can measure the amount of the missing part of the cone, calculate the volume of that, write that number down, and then we can calculate the volume of the tone chamber of the mouthpiece, the cubic capacity, write that number down, and compare those two numbers, and the further apart those two numbers are, the harder it's going to be to play your saxophone in tune. But let's assume, for the purposes of discussion, that we got that figured out, and we're not using some crazy mouthpiece that's inappropriate for our horns. Hopefully using a Saxophone mouthpiece, or maybe a Jody Jazz, since Jody's joining us tonight, and I'm sure there's some other good mouthpiece folks. But you got to pay attention to those numbers and make sure they matched. Okay, now since we got this closed pipe, and we know about how long it is to produce the bottom note, which is low B flat. Now, here's something I need you to understand and think this through, is that if we start up at the mouthpiece end, we got that wave doing this, and then as the bore spreads, the wave starts doing this, and it has less and less energy. Less energy. Yeah, because the amplitude of that wave is different. So they spread out as the waves spread out as they travel down toward the bell. The amplitude gets smaller, and that means that by the time you get to the end, to the bell, and you can put your hand there, have somebody play a low B flat on your horn, put your hand there, and guess what? There is not a lot of pressure right there. Well, at the end of the pipe, it's almost equal to the pressure in the room. The mouthpiece, and on the other end, of course, there, as you blow into that thing, if you put your hand over just the mouthpiece as you blow it, you'll see there's a lot more pressure there than there is down about a low B flat. Now, if you're dealing with a conical pipe, remember, those waves spread more. But just for the purposes of discussion, what about a clarinet or flute? Well, a clarinet and a flute don't have that spread, so their waves maintain that symmetry as you're going down. All right, now, if we're talking about standing waves that are going through the cone of our mouthpiece, of our saxophone, understand that we have predictable wavelengths, because we did the math and we knew how long to make that tube, and we know that the wave's got to go down, get to the still air, or the nearest open tone hole, and then come back, okay? So the length of the wave is the length of the bore times 2, okay? Or the length up to the nearest open tone hole, and that's once we overblow that and double that frequency, then we get the first overtone, which is an octave. And then we can continue to do that. Now, the frequency is the wave speed divided by the wave length. And so The longest wave that you can generate in the saxophone is the one that gives you low B flat or low A in the case you bari players. So remember that we got to do that. Now with all the holes closed, remember the wavelength is twice the length of the horn. Now, you can change I hate to say change your embouchure, because when I'm teaching my students altissimo, we want to be sure there ain't not any moving around at the lower lip. No, sir, we don't allow that here. But you learn to do this with your throat and your oral cavity. But by doing that, I can change which harmonic is coming out of the horn. So the bore of the saxophone, as we said, has got several naturally occurring resonances. And the reed also has got a resonance. And here's what we got to do. We have to get the sound that's coming out of just the mouthpiece to be the correct one to match up with one of those resonances within the saxophone, or you don't have a prayer in hell of playing in tune. Now that was something that the great Sandy Runyon drilled into my thick little head about the importance of getting the right sound out of just the reed, that oscillation to work with a horn. And so that's very good. Now remember that when we begin to increase the pressure that we're blowing, what goes on is that, man, live, we start getting all these other harmonics. They were there all along, but sooner or later we overblow the fundamental, and they began to, the harmonics become the dominant sound. Understand that when you're playing softly now, remember that those waves, that energy wave, has a nice symmetry to it. It's very well balanced. But the harder you blow and the more harmonics you force out of your horn, what happens is that the wave begins to get a little rough and all that. Sound gets brighter and a little harsher. The harder you blow, the harsher it gets. Now, by the way, it's never too late for you people to share this or like it, tell your friends and neighbors about it, and such as that. Now, if you open the tone holes on the saxophone, start at low B flat, and as you come up, you go to low B, then you go to low C, and low C sharp, low D, etc. Come up chromatically. What you're actually doing is you're changing the effective end of the horn, or what we in the trade call a pressure node. And each one of those tone holes corresponds to a semitone in a chromatic scale. Now, how do we know where to put the tone holes? Well, there are some formulas, but I promise no higher math, but I'll tell you for the purposes of discussion that each tone hole moves up from beginning at the end of the bell by about 6%. And that will give you roughly the correct location for the effective center of that tone hole. Now, I'm going to tell you that there's more to it than that, because the bore taper gets involved in that. The way the neck is working does all that. But basically, the tone holes are 6% apart. Now, understand this. As we open tone holes, what happens is it's just like taking a saw and cutting part of the horn off. It makes it shorter. Is that a good thing? Well, yeah, if you want to play a chromatic scale. But here's the thing. You got to understand that as those things are going through there, on the larger tone holes, low B flat, low B, low C sharp, all those are significantly bigger than the ones, say, operated by the left hand. Wait a minute. As you open those up, there is a large area, so there is less pressure. Whereas you open a smaller tone hole up on the left hand, and those tone holes get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the air pressure inside the tone hole gets bigger, and so it's harder to get that wave to do what we want to, and you wonder why. Yes, Casey, 6% of the total length of the horn. And you wonder why it's hard to play your upper notes in tune? That's why, once again, the laws of physics, have got us again. Now, understand that the frequency of these waves as they go through here are dependent on the fingerings that you're using, and we're going to talk about some of these cross fingerings and such that in a few minutes. But as we go through here, what's going to happen is just because a fingering works in one register doesn't mean that it's going to give perfect results in the next register. Ask anybody that's ever tried to play a fourth line D. It's problematic. So that's the art in saxophone design, is not getting the fundamentals to lower octave to work. I'm not going to say it's a no-brainer, but it's pretty easy. But the fact of the matter is, the real trick is getting the octaves to match. And so let's talk about that octave business a bit. As you know, the saxophone has on the back one octave key that's operated by the thumb, unless you got a saxophone made category 5, it's got 2, because it's got 4 different octave vents. But your saxophone only has 2 octave vents. And it's an automatic mechanism that was devised about 1885, because back then some saxophones had as many as 4 individual keys on the back, and you had to, your thumb would get sore just playing some. But the fact of the matter is that our automatic mechanism, the key that's on the bottom that's at about the location of the high E tone hole, covers the notes from the 4th line D up to G sharp right above the staff. And the next one covers the notes from A on up to, say, F sharp or G if you got a saxophone made Super 400. But anyway, those things, we got 2 vents, but we got 12 semitones in a chromatic scale. How can that be? In a perfect world, we would need a total of 12 vents, 1 for every semitone of the chromatic scale. And I'm going to tell you that even though my company currently does manufacture a horn with 4 octave vents, is that we have built one as a prototype that had 6. And I'll tell you, it would hold adjustments for 5 minutes at a time, maybe, if the mechanism got way too complicated. So, never made it to production. Now, here's something you need to understand. And you probably got this figured out anyway if you played saxophone any amount of time. If you play on the upper stack, the C with the middle finger, versus the first finger versus, those horns on most saxophones have got a pretty different pitch and a pretty different timbre. And particularly if you get up in the upper octave, the difference becomes even more pronounced. And that's why if you look on our Super 400 horns, we put an upper stack speaker key to resolve that problem because it needs additional venting. Now, in a cylindrical pipe, like a clarinet or a flute, when you press that octave vent, what happens is it disrupts the fundamental, okay? And it takes you somewhere else. But in a cylindrical pipe, clarinet or flute, it takes you up a 12th. God bless Adolph Sax for using a conical bore, so we can press our octave key, and a closed conical pipe overblows, by pressing the octave key, an octave, an almost perfect octave. And so, man, that works good. Now, let's talk about some other problems that come up in saxophones. Is if you were playing a C with the middle finger of the left hand, whether it's on the third space or above staff, doesn't matter. The effect's still the same. You are closing with this finger, you are closing the bis key, you closing the A key, and the music goes round and round, and you closing another little pad up here at the top. But the B is open in between those. Now, remember when I said that as the wave comes through the horn, the pressure is higher on the smaller diameter tone hole. Well, just like all of us humans, sound waves coming through a saxophone are lazy, and when they encounter a little bit of resistance, increased pressure, they might try to head on down to the next tone hole, see if they can get some relief. And that's the truth. And so what happens is, when you're designing your saxophones, you have to carefully figure out that there's going to be a lot of what's called cross-fitting involved. In other words, an open key in between two closed ones, and make allowance for the fact that what you thought was the effective center of that tone hole in reality isn't. And I'll tell you, it'll make you crazy trying to match those octaves. It absolutely will. Now the same thing happens on our F with the right hand, F sharp, add the key played with the ring finger, or use the middle finger. It's exactly the same thing. So understand that an open tone hole that connects to the outside air has an acoustic pressure of about 0. But if they're small tone holes, the smaller the tone hole is, the further that pressure gets away from 0, and the more problems you have. And this is called cutoff frequency, and in closing a hole that's downstream extends what's called the standing wave, the resonance, a little further, and suddenly you're in trouble about which resonant frequencies you were planning on getting out of there. They may play a little flat. So the effect cross frequency can be very, very dramatic. And if you don't believe me, you play a C and then close the G, see what happens, and such as that. So it's a fact that the harmonics that sound when you're playing a low note won't be as affected as the ones from the higher notes. So this is why the upper register of the saxophone can be so maddeningly difficult to figure out how to get those octaves to match, and how to get those notes up there to play without a shrill, thin voice, much less play in tune. So now you can change some of this by changing mouthpieces. And, oh man, now here we really go down the rabbit hole. And I know my friend Jody Espina, who I hope is still watching, but Jody will agree that you have to carefully match the mouthpiece to the saxophone and to the player. A mouthpiece that's right for me may not be right for you, and vice versa. And you need to understand that the pressure inside the mouthpiece, which is where all of these waves start, is critical. And that when the reed is pushed outward by the pressure inside the mouthpiece increasing, something happens, the reed gets as far out as it can, and then it snaps back, and it gets drawn further back by a suction created by the bore. And this changes the frequency of each resonance just a little, and this is why soft reeds, which are more responsive to these variations from that pressure variation inside the mouthpiece, that's why soft reeds tend to play a little flat for a lot of people. And if you want a little more stability in your playing, you might want to try some harder reeds. Now, the effect is going to be greater on the high notes and the low notes, but soft reeds tend to make the intervals narrower, and hard reeds tend to make the intervals a little wider. And that's very useful to know. Now, let me say this. I'm 68 years old, and at my age, I like soft reeds and soft foods. Who can blame me? All right, now, understand that as we were talking about the tone holes and the wave rocks along inside there till it gets to the nearest open tone hole, and at that point, it opens up to the outside air, and it shortens the effective length of the tube. And so it's reflected back to the mouthpiece, and it gets more complicated with the high notes. And that's because the air in the tone holes has mass. And for the waves to pass through the tone hole, they have to push that mass out. And it's easier to push through a larger hole than it is through a smaller hole. So high frequency waves are going to be impeded by the air in a smaller tone hole because it just doesn't look open to them. And so they rock on down till they find a easier place of exit. And so if the waves have enough frequency and enough energy behind them, they'll blow right past open tone holes. And at that point, what's going to happen is that if you get to bypassing tone holes that were put there with the thought in mind that this is where it ought to be to catch that resonance of the bore, you might be in trouble. So you need to understand that a saxophone is only going to play notes with a frequency that are lower than the natural frequency of the reed. And that's why, if you want good results, don't tighten up, don't play too tight, and try to get that initial pitch on the mouthpiece to be too tight, because what's going to happen is you're going to get the upper range of the frequency of the reed is going to exceed the saxophone, and you're not going to be real happy if we don't have frequencies on the saxophone that are lower than the frequency of the reed. That's just the way it's got to be. So understand how important all of that is. Now, understand that clarinets and saxophones, clarinet is cylindrical bore, essentially. I know it's not a perfect cylinder, but it almost is. And saxophones are conical bore. And this explains why a soprano saxophone in the key of B flat has a length of about 700 millimeters, whereas a soprano clarinet, standard B flat clarinet, is about 670 millimeters. And so the resonance of a clarinet, the natural resonances that occur within that cylindrical bore, remember that a conical bore is different, but in that cylindrical bore, those resonances occur at different places. And all the harmonics occur at different places. And you wonder why a clarinet can play a lot lower notes than a saxophone. That would be hey, Brother Mike Fortenberry, good to see you here, buddy. Now, understand that the clarinet can play lower notes, true, but it comes at a price. And the price is, of course, a clarinet, you press the register key on your clarinet, and it's going to overblow a 12th, whereas, man, us saxophone players, we got it made. Let's just play that up an octave. No problem, just press the octave key, and it goes up essentially a perfect octave, and that makes it easier. So the clarinet players, and also they have to deal with that tremolo register and all that good stuff. It's a problem, and a clarinet also, no matter what they try to do, is a clarinet is never going to play as loud as a saxophone, and I'll gladly, I'll gladly wrestle any woman in here, and I'll gladly, you bring any clarinet in here, and I'll play louder on my baritone sax than I do on that. Now, the resonances, understand that the resonances become weaker as the frequency increases. You've only got a finite amount of energy, so you can spread it out, or you can compress it, and you can have, weaker resonances, or you can have, stronger ones, depending on the length of this. The friction of the moving air inside the instrument against the walls is viscous, and this affects the higher frequencies more than the lower frequencies. So understand that what's going to happen is we're always going to have more trouble with them damn high notes. And so the problem faced by conical instruments is that the first resonance, the naturally occurring resonance, is pretty weak. At very low frequencies, it's easier to move the air backwards and forwards. That's why it's really pretty easy to get a nice honking low B flat out. But as you get to the upper frequencies toward the small end, it becomes more and more difficult because the resonances get weaker and weaker and weaker. All right, now let's talk about something that's widely misunderstood, and I'll be admit that I've been guilty of using this as a marketing tool without fully explaining it. Now, I was right about everything I told you, but I didn't always tell you the complete story of why. And that's about the effect of the bell on a saxophone. Now, the bell of a saxophone is got a nice flair to it. Why is it there? Well, it's there to radiate that sound out, give it projection. And, it being a conical bore now, it has some effect, but not as dramatic effect as you take a trombone. And you take the bell off, where you're just playing the rest of it without that last section. Ain't much noise there. You put the bell on a trombone and you got a bunch of noise. So it helps the waves come out of the bore and radiate. And the presence of a large bell is going to make your saxophone a little bit louder. But there's another benefit. Beyond the third P, as we calculating all our overtones and getting into those upper notes, the bell actually has a lot of effect on the overtones, particularly the altissimo notes. Didn't know that, did you? The fact of the matter is that if I told you, hey, look, our saxophone's got a big bell and it's going to help you with the high notes, you'd look at me like I was crazy. Well, I'm not. I've been doing this a long time. And I tell you, it makes a lot of difference because when we are designing our saxophones, we'll try the same horn, same body tube, and all that with different bells and, see what kind of results we get. The bell reduces the first resonance, but it improves the second and the third. But it does help radiate the whole thing. So anyway, you'll get a lot more power and all that if you get your bell size right. So that's all we're going to cover tonight. I didn't want to dig down into some of that stuff that was too technical tonight. Next time we're going to talk about standing waves and ooh-wee baby, all kind of technical stuff. We may actually have to get that whiteboard out. But I just wanted to let you dip your feet in the water a little bit and try to understand a little bit about what effect acoustic science does have. Now, I also want to caution you once again. There are a lot of experts out there on the internet who are totally self-appointed. And these guys are going to tell you, well, I read this, I read that. Of course, they don't understand the damn thing that they read in the first place. And when they start that stuff where you say, by the way, could I see some horns that you designed and you manufactured? Oh, you don't have any. So you ain't actually ever done this, have you? That's right. That's the truth. So anyway, if you have questions about saxophone acoustics and all that, I am happy to answer them. Feel free to call me at my office during business hours, which is 10 a.m. till 3 p.m. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Central Daylight Time. I'm usually in the office during those hours, and as long as I'm not on the phone helping another customer or going and getting a fancy lunch, I'll be glad to take your call and answer your questions. We have put up a couple of articles that I wrote for, one for the Saxophone Journal, one for Saxophone Today magazine, and they're on my Nation of Music site. Just go to the articles list, and there's several articles in there. One of them is about saxophone bores. One of them is about an introduction to saxophone acoustics, and I'm going to warn you that, yes, they do have a lot of higher math involved in them. There's also an article in there about necks. It's called Saxophonist Guide to Necking. And at any rate, it explains how important the taper and all that good stuff that goes on the neck is to getting your saxophone to play right. Now, another thing that we have done in the interest of furthering this discussion is, as you know, I've got about, I think the total is 15 different saxophone-related discussion groups on Facebook. And the most recent one is Saxophone Acoustics. And we've had some good discussions already about saxophone acoustics. If you have questions, that's a good place to ask them. Everybody is welcome to join and participate. Everybody wants to be a troll or tell me what all they've read without really, I ain't gonna let you in. I will kick you off. But if you seriously want to discuss this and contribute or just lurk and try to learn something, that's cool with me. It really is. So that's about all I've got for you tonight. Our good friend Donna Schwartz has got a good seminar coming up on her site in about another 13, 14 minutes. And you'll need to tune in to Donna. She's a very, very smart woman, good teacher, excellent teacher. So, this is Steve Goodson. I am down in our ultra top secret command and control bunker here in Sector R of the city of New Orleans with Saxophone World Headquarters. I've enjoyed talking to you. We'll see you in 2 weeks with more discussion of saxophone acoustics. So, you guys go practice long tones every day. Remember, keep your reed wet and always, always play saxophone. Why? Saxophone plays best. Goodbye for now.